She arrived at Crimson Ridge Farm on an August afternoon in 1932 with a battered leather suitcase, a black-covered notebook that wasn't hers, and the calm conviction of someone who has already lost enough to have nothing left to fear. She didn't arrive by carriage or on horseback. She arrived by wagon, rattling along the last stretch of red dirt road that separated the town from the heavy wooden gate no one had opened for years. And when the wagon stopped, she stepped down, stood in the dust that still took its time settling, looked at the house up ahead with its roof caved in at one corner and the porch covered in shadows and overgrown weeds, and said nothing. She just kept looking. What no one knew at that moment, not even her, was that the farm had been waiting for her, not in a supernatural way, not in the wandering manner of a Gothic romance, but in a very concrete, very human way. There was unfinished business on that land, a ledger that had never been balanced, a story written only halfway for lack of someone with the right reason to finish it. And that someone had finally arrived, carrying a small suitcase, a little notebook full of measurements she didn't completely understand yet, and the right last name. Can you imagine arriving at a place where every single person in town is absolutely certain you'll be leaving soon? Where the general store owner whispered just before she stepped away from the counter, with the delicacy of someone who doesn't want to frighten but can't stay quiet either, "Miss, that land out there is no good. Nobody lasts more than a month." Where the young man driving the wagon stood frozen at the entrance as if he didn't want to cross the gate, not out of real terror, but out of the fear folks passed down from generation to generation like an inheritance. What drives a woman like that to step off the wagon, take a deep breath of the dry brush country and old wood, and say to herself, barely moving her lips, "Well then, I'm staying." This happened in August 1932, deep in rural Texas, in a town called Red Bluff, along the banks of the Brazos River. The farm was called Crimson Ridge, and it had sat dead, forgotten, and branded as cursed for 41 years. What no one rightly understood yet was why. The curse, like any real curse, was much simpler and much sadder than the tall tales people had invented to explain it. Before I continue, I need to know, where are you watching this story from right now? Write your city and state down here in the comments. This channel exists because of each of you, and it makes me so happy to see where the people who follow me come from. And if you aren't subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss any stories. Celeste's journey is just beginning, and she still has no idea what she's going to find inside that farmhouse. Celeste Drummond Anderson was 32 years old and had a way of looking at things that unsettled people. It was the kind of gaze that was a bit too direct for a woman of that era, too calm for a woman alone, and slightly too ironic for someone who had lost her job, her rented apartment, and almost all her savings in the past 8 months. Folks expected someone in that situation to arrive hunched over, with downcast eyes and a meek voice. Celeste arrived standing tall, looked straight ahead, and usually spoke her mind with a brevity some mistook for harshness, but which was merely efficiency. She didn't like spending words where they weren't needed. Whether it was a flaw or a virtue depended entirely on who was doing the judging. She had been a telegraph operator at the Central Union Station in Galveston for 6 years. She knew Morse code the way she knew her own name, tapping the key with the precision of a musician, and she had the reputation of never making a mistake on a message, not even the longest or the most urgent ones. It was a job she genuinely loved, not because it was glamorous, it wasn't. It smelled of grease and carbon paper, and the sweltering Texas summer heat inside that office was enough to drive anyone mad. But because there was something deeply satisfying about translating the whole wide world into dots and dashes, in simplifying what was complicated and making sure the message arrived. It was a skill she would carry with her for the rest of her life without realizing it, even to read things that weren't telegrams. When the station closed in December 1931, by order of the new federal administration trimming the budget after the economic collapse of the Great Depression, Celeste took the news with the exact same expression she always wore. She said her thanks, took the envelope with her back pay, walked down the station steps for the last time, and stood for a long moment on the uneven cobblestone sidewalk, looking out over the port of Galveston in the late afternoon. The Gulf was the color of lead that day. A barge was passing in the distance with a patched sail, and the breeze carried the smell of low tide and fish. She looked at the water and thought in total silence, with the same calm she applied to most things. Well, I guess that's that. In the months that followed, she tried for other posts. There were other telegraph offices, but the positions went to men, and at the time, that wasn't even questioned out loud. It was simply the way of the world. There were commercial offices, but they paid half the wages. There were wealthy families looking for ladies' companions, but she discarded that idea immediately, with an expression her friend Nettie later described as the face of someone biting into a lemon without moving a muscle. In July 1932, with her money nearly gone and her two-room apartment in the commercial district on the verge of being handed back to the landlord, Celeste decided to go through her grandmother Rosalie's trunk. Rosalie had passed away 2 years earlier, and Celeste had kept the trunk without ever finding the emotional resolve to examine it closely. It wasn't a lack of affection, quite the opposite. She had waited until she felt she could open it without sorrow swallowing whatever she might find. The trunk sat under her bed, draped with a cloth. She pulled it out on a Wednesday night, opened it on the floor, and carefully began taking out its contents. There were old clothes smelling of mothballs and thyme, a dark wooden rosary with one broken bead, a yellowed crocheted cloth that had served as a tablecloth at some point in her grandmother's life. And at the very bottom, wrapped in dark burlap and tied with twine, the little black-covered notebook. She opened it on the kitchen table by the light of an oil lamp because the electricity had been shut off that week, and started reading the first page. Grandma Rosalie was a practical woman. Celeste had always known that. Rosalie hadn't told her fairy tales when she was a child. She had taught her how to calculate interest in her head, how to recognize medicinal plants by their leaves, and to never sign a paper she didn't understand. The notebook was exactly that, practical to the extreme, written in tiny handwriting that forced Celeste to lean the lamp closer. There were construction measurements in inches and feet, medicinal recipes with precise dosages, names of plants alongside their properties, lists of materials with era-appropriate prices, and here and there sandwiched between technical notes, fragments of sentences without beginning or end, like pieces of a thought that had been interrupted. One of these sentences was written on the second page, right after a calculation for the volume of excavated dirt, in handwriting slightly different from the rest of the page. Slower, pressed harder into the paper, as if written with an emotion the hand couldn't quite contain. The water will enter from the north side, where the bank is lowest, and will run 140 feet straight to the crop field. When that happens, the earth will breathe again. Celeste read the sentence twice. She didn't understand it. She turned to the next page. 2 weeks later, leafing through an old newspaper she'd found in a diner while waiting out a rainstorm, she saw the ad. It was small, tucked into the bottom corner of a page full of news about the economic crisis and political woes. It simply read, "For lease, Crimson Ridge Farm, Red Bluff, Texas, 300 acres, rate negotiable, inquire with Horace, County Clerk." Celeste read the name Red Bluff and froze for a moment, but it was the name Sterling connected to the town that she recognized from the notebook. It was in one of her grandmother's little unfinished sentences, written on a middle page in handwriting so small she had almost skipped over it. "Edward Sterling, I wrote your name here because I have nowhere else to write it." She stared at the newspaper ad long enough for the waiter to walk over and ask if she wanted to order anything else. She asked for a black coffee, folded the paper carefully, slipped it into her skirt pocket, and watched the rain beat against the window pane as she drank slowly. The next morning, she went to the post office and wired a telegram to the county clerk in Red Bluff. By the following week, she had signed the lease by mail. She paid 6 months in advance with what remained of her savings, handed her apartment keys back to the landlord, and mailed Nettie a one-line letter. "I've moved out to the country. Will send word when I settle." Nettie replied 2 days later, "Celeste, you are crazy." Celeste wrote back, "Probably," and she packed her bags. The journey took 4 days. From Galveston to Houston by bus, bouncing over dirt roads with dust seeping through every crack, and an older gentleman beside her who snored with a consistency that could only be admired. From Houston to Waco, hitching a ride in a cured meat delivery truck, which smelled exactly the way one would expect. From Waco down to Red Bluff by boat, charting the Brazos on a small wooden steamboat named the Wild Brush that carried flour, salt, medicine, and 3 passengers besides herself. Celeste spent a good part of the boat trip sitting on the bow, watching the river. The Brazos was different from the Gulf. The sea was restless and impatient, possessing the quality of someone who can never sit still. The river was sluggish, wide, the color of old clay, and she found it beautiful in a way she couldn't explain. The banks were thick with scrub and brush country as they moved along, and every now and then a small shack appeared on the edge, a tied-up canoe, someone fishing in absolute silence as if peace were a solid thing surrounding that man, and the river just a background detail. She arrived in Red Bluff on a Thursday afternoon, the sun still baking and the air carrying the scent of wet earth from a rainstorm 2 days prior. The steamboat bumped against a small wooden dock, and Celeste stepped off with her leather suitcase in hand and the notebook tucked securely in a canvas satchel slung across her chest. Red Bluff was a town with one main dirt road, a general store, an adobe schoolhouse, a church with a bell, a clerk's office, and low-slung houses with wooden shutters painted faded green or blue. A massive oak tree sat in the center of the square, providing enough shade for a whole family to sit under. And there were folks who stopped and stared at Celeste as if looking at an apparition, not with hostility, but with that specific curiosity native to small towns where every new face is an event. She went straight to the clerk's office. The clerk's name was Horace. He was a man in his 60s, with a white mustache and spectacles that constantly slid to the tip of his nose, which he corrected with his index finger in a gesture so automatic he clearly didn't realize he was doing it anymore. He received her with the expression of a man signing off on something he knows will cause town gossip, but obliged to do so because the paperwork was in order. He handed over the keys, one large iron key, a smaller brass one, with the demeanor of someone returning something to nature, hoping nature knew what to do with it. He asked if there was anything she'd like to know before heading out. Horace wiped his spectacles with his handkerchief, set them back on his nose, and mentioned that there were stories about the place that had circulated around town for a long time, but he wasn't a man to put stock in tall tales. The land was good, the creek ran year-round, the house was old but structurally sound, and the lease rate was fair precisely because previous tenants hadn't stuck around. Celeste asked why they hadn't stayed. Horace answered slowly that some said the land was cursed, that since 1891 nothing had prospered in that dirt, that anyone who tried to live there packed up in under a month, claiming there was something strange in the air, something that just wouldn't let things grow, and that the history behind it was very old, from before he was even the clerk. Celeste nodded, pocketed the keys, and said she'd be fine, that she'd just need the wagon to haul her suitcase. The young man driving the wagon was named Danny. He was 17 and possessed a curiosity he could barely suppress beneath a serious face he was still learning how to wear. On the red dirt path to the farm, between clay banks and stretches of brush that smelled of dry wood and sap, he tossed out questions with the caution of someone skipping stones on water to see how far the ripples go. "Did you come from far away, Mom? Are you really gonna stay? Ain't you scared of the curse?" Celeste replied that she came from Galveston, that she fully intended to stay, and that she didn't believe in curses. Danny went quiet for a moment, swaying with the wagon over the rutted path. Then he said with genuine solemnity, "Everybody in town is dead certain the place is cursed. There was even a whole family that tried a few years back, and they up and left in 3 weeks. The father wouldn't say a word about what happened, but you could tell something sure did." Celeste asked where the story of the curse came from, how long folks had been talking about it. Danny said since 1891, that there was an old story of a love ruined on that land, and that the woman left cursing the place, that ever since the farm wouldn't prosper and people couldn't bear to stay. Celeste looked at the red road ahead. An egret landed on the edge of the path and stood frozen, as still as a clay sculpture, its eyes fixed on some point in the ditch water. The sun was slowly sinking, and the shadows of the brush stretched eastward in golden streaks, cutting across the reddish earth. She said nothing for a moment. Then she murmured, more to herself than to Danny, that it was a sad story. Danny agreed that it sure was. The farm appeared after a sharp bend, behind a row of twisted mesquite trees that had grown leaning away from the wind, as if for years they had been trying to pull away from something but could never get far enough. The gate was heavy wood with rusted ironwork, and the wire holding it shut had been tied and retied so many times it formed a knot of steel. Celeste climbed down from the wagon, patiently untwisted the wire, her fingers working each knot without rushing, like someone who knows haste is useless, pushed the gate, which groaned on its hinges with the sound of something that didn't expect to be called upon, and walked in. The smell changed the moment she crossed the threshold. It became denser, older, as if the air inside had stood still long enough to develop a memory. It smelled of sun-baked hardwood, of dry earth with a hint of dampness underneath, of wild weeds growing unchecked, and deeper still, harder to name, something she could only describe as waiting. The scent of a place that had been cast aside, but had kept holding its breath anyway. The main house was large by the region standards. It had 3 front windows with wooden shutters pulled tight, a shingled wraparound porch hugging 2 sides of the building, and adobe walls with whitewash peeling off in thick flakes to reveal the red dirt beneath. The roof had sagged in one corner, and moss was growing there as if nature were trying to patch what time had worn away. The weeds had grown wild in the yard, up to her waist, with the brazen freedom of plants that know nobody is coming to pull them. But there was something about the bones of the house that held strong. The walls were solid, the windows locked with latches that still functioned, the hardwood porch pillars as sturdy as the day they were raised decades ago. Danny stood near the entrance, looking like he badly wanted to bolt, but didn't want to be impolite. Celeste unloaded her suitcase with him, thanked him, paid the agreed fare, and told him she was all right, that he could head back. The boy left, and Celeste was alone. She stood in the middle of the yard for a moment, her suitcase at her feet, the late afternoon sun hitting her from the side. The silence wasn't absolute. There was the distant sound of the creek out back, the hum of insects, the wind rustling the mesquite leaves, but there was a core stillness that was unlike any quiet she had ever known in Galveston. City silence always has some background noise that people stop hearing out of habit. This stillness was alive. It was the kind that makes a person hear their own heartbeat. She looked at the house, looked at the stone fence running around the yard, looked out back where a smaller structure sat, likely an old barn. Then she looked at the sky, which was just beginning to turn burnt orange in the west, with the luxurious slowness of country sunsets. Then she picked up her suitcase, climbed the 3 porch steps that groaned softly under her weight, opened the heavy front door with the large iron key, walked inside, and went to work. Cleaning the house took 2 days. 2 days of sweeping, wet rags, hauling buckets of water from the creek, using a rusty but sturdy pail she found in the barn, and enough sweat to soak through 2 blouses. The house had 3 rooms besides the kitchen, a large bedroom with a wooden bed frame missing a mattress, the wood so dry it had become as solid as a cabinet, a parlour that had served as an office, judging by the heavy desk in the centre, its drawers sticking tight and smelling of stale paper, and a smaller room with shelves that had been a pantry, now empty and quiet as a lung that no longer breathes. On the wooden porch floor, there was a section that sounded hollow when stepped on, and she made a mental note to investigate it later when she had more time. She slept her first night in the large bedroom, using her suitcase as a pillow and keeping the notebook right beside her, after eating what she'd brought from town in a cloth sack. A chunk of hard salted cheese, dry cornbread, and a block of molasses. She ate slowly, sitting on the bare floorboards with her back against the wall, listening to the wild brush at night. It was different from the sea and different from the city. It was quieter in some moments, and yet much fuller in others. Full of sounds she didn't yet recognize. Crickets layering their chirps, as if taking turns on a shift. The call of some night bird she couldn't name. The groaning of the house's timber settling into the midnight chill. And once, far off in the distance, what she figured must be a mountain lion slipping through the brush on silent paws. She didn't feel fear. She felt something closer to attention, like when a telegram first starts coming through the wire and you don't know what it's going to say yet, but you know it's important. On the morning of the second day, while sweeping the front yard with a straw broom she'd found leaning against the kitchen wall, she heard footsteps. She looked up and saw a man standing at the gate, his hand resting on the wire she had simply hooked back in place. He looked to be in his early 30s, hard to tell from a distance, average height, shoulders built by a lifetime of physical labor, wearing dark cotton trousers and a white shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He held a leather hat in his hand, not on his head. The morning sun hit him from the side, making his expression hard to read. He called out from a distance, his voice carrying more inquiry than hostility. "Are you the new tenant?" Celeste said she was. He asked if he could come in. She said he could. He stepped inside, unhooked the wire behind him, with the automatic grace of a boy who had done that motion his whole life, and walked toward her. He stopped about 10 feet away, a distance she recognized as deliberate. Not too far to seem suspicious, not too close to seem intrusive. A respectful distance. His name was Henry Sterling. He said his last name with a lightness that felt rehearsed, or perhaps the lightness came from a long habit of dropping the name and watching how people's faces reacted. Celeste had no special reaction. The name meant nothing to her at that moment beyond the clerk's office. She mentioned that his surname was on the clerk's office sign where she'd processed her lease. He said yes. That the office had belonged to his father, Arthur Sterling, who passed away 4 years ago. That it was now run by Horace. He also added that he had only come to introduce himself, that he was the school teacher in town, that he lived on a small property 2 miles down the road toward the village, that if she needed anything at all these first few days, he would be available to help. Celeste asked if he was the one who had placed the lease ad. He said no, that the decision had been made by his mother, Mrs. Eulalia Sterling, who had finally decided that letting the land sit idle made no sense after so many years. Celeste processed this. She thanked him for the visit and said she was fine for now. He nodded, placed his hat back on his head, and turned to leave. He stopped after 2 steps. He turned back around, and this time there was a different kind of hesitation on his face. Not a doubt about what to say, but a heavy weighing of whether it was the right time to say it. He said, slowly, that there was something she perhaps ought to know. That her last name, Anderson, was a name with history on this land, that he wasn't telling her this to cause trouble. He was saying it because it felt only right that she should know, before anything else, that the ground she was standing on wasn't completely foreign to her blood. Celeste stared at him for a moment. The morning sun hit her sideways, and a quail called out from the back near the stone fence with that urgent sound of a bird that doesn't know how much time it has left. She asked what he meant by that. He simply said it was a long story, that whenever she was ready to hear it, he was available, that it wasn't an emergency, just a piece of history that might make a difference for her to know. Then he bid her good morning, walked out the gate, and headed down the dirt road without looking back, his leather hat pulled low and his shoulders squared against the morning Texas sun. Celeste stood there with the broom in her hand, staring at the closed gate for a long time. Then she went back to sweeping. There was a yard to clean. That afternoon she walked into town for supplies. The general store was dim and smelled of tobacco, leather, and cured cheese, a mixture that should have been unpleasant, but was deeply comforting. The owner, Everett, was a stout, kind-hearted man who talked too much, the kind of man who for decades had served as the repository for every piece of news and gossip in the county. He knew who had been born, who had married, who had died, and exactly what each death meant to everyone else. When Celeste gave her name, he froze for a second before fetching her items, and then said, with the voice of a man who simply cannot hold a question in, "You know the history of that farm, don't you?" Celeste replied that she had heard whispers on her way into town, but lacked the details. Everett leaned his hands heavily on the worn wooden counter and declared he was going to tell her, because it was a story every child in Red Bluff grew up knowing. In 1891, Crimson Ridge Farm belonged to the Sterling family. It was prosperous, boasting rich crops and good livestock, and there was a young couple the whole town reckoned would marry. The boy was Edward Sterling, the wealthy farmer's son, 17 years old. The girl was Rosalie Anderson, the daughter of a neighboring small-time farmer, 18 years old. They had been courting in secret for 2 years, and everybody knew it except their fathers. When Edward's father found out about the romance, he was furious. The girl was pretty and honest, but her family had no standing. Her father was drowning in debt, their situation precarious. Edward had been promised in an alliance to another prominent family, a land deal his father deemed vital for the farm's expansion. The son flat out refused, sparking a bitter feud that dragged on for weeks. Edward unyielding on one side, his father unyielding on the other. In the end, the one who broke was Rosalie's father. He showed up at the Sterling farm one night, according to eyewitnesses, and dragged his daughter away by force with an urgency no one fully understood until much later. Rosalie fought him tooth and nail from the back of the wagon. Edward tried to run after her, but his father held him back. Celeste stood with her elbows resting on the counter, her face perfectly still. Everett continued, saying the story didn't end there, that Edward waited. He waited months, then a whole year. He rode out to the town where Rosalie's family had moved, but she was already married. Her father had arranged a quick union to prevent any repeat of the scandal. Edward returned to the farm. He stayed. He refused every other match his father tried to force on him, and the land never bloomed again. The townspeople claimed it was a curse, that Rosalie had cursed the soil as she was dragged away. But Everett leaned in, speaking with a blunt honesty that did him credit. The truth, I see, is a whole lot simpler and a whole lot sadder. Edward just stopped caring for the earth, let it all go to ruin, and folks made up a curse to explain what was just the deep sorrow of a man who lost what he loved and couldn't figure out where to put his feet down anymore. Celeste remained silent after he finished. Then she asked for her change and gathered her paper-wrapped groceries. At the threshold of the door, she stopped and asked, "This Rosalie, do you happen to know her full middle name?" Everett nodded. "Rosalie Drummond Anderson." Celeste walked out of the store and stood in the middle of the dirt street, the late afternoon sun beating against the back of her neck, flies buzzing lazily around her groceries. In the distance, the Brazos River gleamed through the riverside brush like a ribbon of polished steel. Rosalie Drummond Anderson, The exact name written on Celeste's own birth certificate on the line that read, maternal grandmother. The same name written in the black-covered notebook. The same name that had been for 32 years part of a family history repeated endlessly without Celeste ever truly grasping the weight of what she was repeating. She walked back to the farm in the afternoon heat, alone on the red dirt road, breathing just a little deeper than usual, the groceries heavy in her arms. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She did what she always did when something too massive for words occurred. She stayed quiet and let her thoughts settle slowly, like silt drifting to the river bottom after the water's been stirred. Back at the farm, she sat on the porch, opened the little notebook to the first page, and began reading it from the beginning with entirely new eyes. The notebook had 47 pages. Celeste read every single one that afternoon, late into the night, and through the next morning, first by the light of the oil lamp, and then by the sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. She read slowly, because Rosalie's handwriting was tiny and often difficult, and because there were things she needed to read more than once to truly comprehend what sat in her hands. Most of the pages were indeed practical. Construction measurements, medicinal recipes with doses scribbled in the margins, supply lists with quantities and prices, calculations for area and volume. But there was another layer, woven into that practicality, like threads of a different color in a bolt of fabric that you only see when you hold it up to the light. There were notes that weren't technical. They were memories disguised as utility. On a page detailing the depth measurements for an excavation trench, her grandmother had written in the margin, "The bedrock sits 2.5 feet below the bank's drop-off." Edward taught me that, said it was the secret to the whole canal, that the water won't carve through the stone, it'll flow around it. On a recipe for a fever poultice with exact weight-based dosages, there was a single line at the footer in a different, slower script. "When I get back, I'm going to plant wild honeysuckle by the bedroom window. He knows it's my favorite flower." And on a page very near the end, on a sheet that had been folded inward, one Celeste had almost missed because it was wedged between 2 pages of lists, there was an entire paragraph, written in a rush, pressing harder into the paper than any other page, as if the hand had trembled slightly while writing, or as if it had been penned in a moment of sheer determination, requiring every ounce of strength. "I didn't go back. I will never be able to go back, but I've left everything I know about this land right here because someone someday is going to need it. The soil is good. It just needs water. The canal we planned together was never built, and without it, the North Field will bake dry every single summer. The measurements are in this book. I am not cursing anything. I'm keeping safe what I know about a place I loved, because keeping it safe is the only way I have left to care for it." Celeste folded the page back, closed the notebook, and stared at the adobe wall of the bedroom for a length of time she couldn't measure. The oil lamp cast a long shadow of her profile against the wall, hissing softly, the only sound in the quiet house. Then she opened the notebook again and began studying the measurements for the canal. Over the next few days, she went into town 3 more times. She bought tools, a new hoe, a long iron crowbar, a thick spool of sisal rope. She bought lime and mortar to patch the sagging roof. She bought corn, bean, and pumpkin seeds. She bought a thin straw mattress that fit in the back of a rented wagon folded in half, which would serve far better than her suitcase for sleeping. And during one of her trips, she bought a kerosene lantern that would burn longer and brighter than the old oil lamp. Everett greeted her with growing respect and diminishing surprise each time. On her 3rd visit, while tallying up her order, he proudly informed her that the whole town was buzzing with the news that she was actually staying. That bets had been placed on her fleeing within the 1st week, but the week had passed, and she was still out there. Celeste said that was exactly her intention. Everett lowered his voice, acting like a man about to spill a secret he probably shouldn't, but simply couldn't hold back. There's one person in town who might not be too thrilled about the news. Mrs. Eulalia Sterling, Henry's mother, spoke up at the church social last week saying she didn't approve of the lease, that renting out the land was a mistake and renting it to an Anderson was a far bigger one. Celeste accepted the gossip with the same polite indifference she'd give a weather report, attentive, zero drama. In the fourth week, Henry returned. He showed up on a working morning, while Celeste was out in the yard trying to figure out what was wrong with the patch of earth north of the house. The brush here was sparser, the soil drier, cracked into thin, jagged plates that looked like shattered pottery. It was the exact area Rosalie had described in her notebook as the field needing the canal to breathe. Henry stopped at the gate and watched her for a moment before speaking. She was kneeling in the dirt, examining the profile of a small embankment, with an intensity he clearly hadn't expected to see, the open notebook in her left hand, using a small twig in her right to scrape away the topsoil and see what lay beneath. He said good morning and asked what she was doing. She looked up and said she was trying to locate the lowest point of the bank, that there was a grade difference she needed to calculate exactly before breaking ground. He stood there for a moment, watching her study the earth. There was something in it, in her fierce concentration, in the gesture of scraping the soil like someone dusting off an old text to read it better, that caught him off guard. Then he asked if he could come in. She told him he could. He walked over, looked at the embankment, then down at the notebook. He asked if he could see it. She hesitated for a split second, not out of distrust, but because there was something in that little black book that felt so deeply tied to her grandmother, and to herself, that handing it over felt like an act of profound trust she wasn't sure she was ready to give. But then she looked at his face, guarded not out of malice, but with the armor of a man carrying a heavy load who had long ago learned to keep it hidden, and she handed it over. He read slowly. Celeste watched his eyes track the page. There was something in the way he held the book with an unprompted gentleness, like a man who realizes he's holding something fragile without needing to be told, that revealed more about him than all his spoken words combined. When he finished reading the page on the canal measurements, he fell silent. He handed the notebook back and said that whoever wrote that understood agricultural hydraulics, that the figures were dead on, that he had studied this type of rural engineering back when he was at university in Houston, and that the canal described in those pages was absolutely viable. Celeste said she knew. He looked up at her. There was a flash of surprise in his eyes that he quickly masked, but not quickly enough to escape her notice. He asked who had written it. Celeste answered, "My grandmother, Rosalie Drummond Anderson." There was a silence that stretched far longer than a normal silence. It was the kind of quiet that carries weight, the kind that leaves a ripple in the air, like when something massive flies just inches past your face. Henry simply said, "Oh," just one syllable. But an entire world was packed into that sound, and Celeste heard it clearly because she had spent 6 years of her life translating entire worlds into simple sounds. He then added carefully that he had tried to tell her the history of the farm on his first visit, that she had told him it could wait. Celeste said she knew it all now, that she'd figured it out on her own, between the notebook and the storekeeper. He asked what she had felt when she found out. It was an unexpected question. Celeste wasn't used to people asking how she felt about things. The world of the 1930s demanded results, not emotions, and she had adapted to that reality so thoroughly that the question sounded almost foreign. She took a moment to calibrate her answer. Finally, she said she felt she understood what she was doing here much better than the day she signed the lease. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said he would help her dig the canal if she'd have him. She said she would, and that was how it started. Over the next 3 days, Celeste studied the notebook with redoubled intensity, now knowing exactly what she was looking at. Rosalie's measurements were incredibly detailed, excavation depths at 3 distinct points along the route, the required slope calculated in degrees with fractions noted in the margins, the exact distance from the water's entry point to the crop field measured out to the inch. There was even a materials list calculating the volume of stone needed to line the canal walls and prevent erosion along the bends. It was a complete blueprint. The blueprint of an 18-year-old girl who had learned soil engineering out in the field, listening, watching, and calculating alongside someone who truly understood the land. It was a plan written on a soil she loved, for a soil she loved that had been trapped on paper for 41 years, waiting for someone with the right reason to carve it into the earth. On the afternoon of the 3rd day of planning, while Celeste was out on the porch with the notebook open to the schematics and the sunlight slowly creeping down the trunk of the mesquite tree, she stepped on the floorboard that sounded hollow. She stopped. She stepped on it again. The sound was distinct. It wasn't wood rot, it wasn't termites, it was an empty void underneath, a space carved out with intent. She went to fetch her iron crowbar. Carefully wedging the tool between 2 planks, she pried the section of flooring up. The wood gave way with a soft crack, revealing a small hollow dug into the dirt foundation below, roughly the size of a cigar box. Nestled inside the hollow was a folded piece of burlap, darkened by dampness and time. Celeste lifted it out gently. She unwrapped the coarse cloth. Inside lay a fine white linen handkerchief, its edges intricately embroidered with delicate blue flowers. The needlework belonged to someone with true skill. There was a tenderness to the stitches, a rhythmic perfection born of patience and deep love for the task, and in the bottom right corner, embroidered in crimson thread as fine as a strand of hair, were the letters R.A. Rosalie Anderson. Celeste stared at the handkerchief for a very long time, crouching there on the porch planks, the pride board beside her and the dark hole beneath. The late afternoon sun slanted through the porch pillars, striking the linen perfectly, illuminating the embroidery as if someone were shining a lantern directly onto it. She didn't cry, but she drew a deep breath and stayed utterly still, long enough for the shadow of the mesquite tree to crawl 2 feet across the yard. Her grandmother had been on this farm. She had embroidered a handkerchief with the flowers someone had taught her to love. She had buried it beneath the porch floorboards, not by accident, not out of forgetfulness. She had left it there on purpose. Just like the message in the notebook, just like the canal measurements, just like the little unfinished sentences, left there to remain, to be found by someone with the right reason to come looking. Celeste folded the handkerchief with infinite care, placed it on top of the closed notebook on the parlor table, and went out to fetch water from the creek. She had a canal to start staking. It was later that same week that Mrs. Eulalia made her appearance. Celeste was outside, marking the canal's path with wooden stakes and sisal twine, kneeling in the dirt with the notebook open beside her and a makeshift water level she had devised to check the grade. When she heard the rattle of a wagon on the road, she looked up and saw a woman stepping down, assisted by the young man driving, moving with the decisive clip of someone not paying a social call, the posture of a woman arriving with a purpose. Mrs. Eulalia Sterling was 62 years old and carried herself like a woman who had never once accepted a disagreeable situation without making her absolute displeasure known. She was tall, sharp-angled, her white hair pulled back into a severe bun, dressed in dark fabrics that weren't strictly mourning clothes, but carried a touch of grief about them, as if her body had decided long ago that bright colors were no longer suitable. Her eyes were coal-black and piercing, and when she reached Celeste, she stopped 3 feet away and sized her up with a deliberate, sweeping gaze before speaking a word. She announced that she was Eulalia Sterling, that this property had belonged to her family, and that they needed to discuss the lease. Celeste stood up, wiped her hands, and said she was Celeste Anderson, that the lease was signed and filed at the clerk's office, and that it was a pleasure to receive her. There was a pregnant pause as the two women measured each other. Mrs. Eulalia held the advantage of habitual authority, accustomed to being obeyed in a county where the weight of her family name still commanded the room. Celeste held the advantage of simply not caring about any of that, an advantage impossible to counter because it offers no leverage. Mrs. Eulalia stated that there had been a grave misunderstanding when the property was listed for lease, that the town clerk had failed to consult her properly regarding acceptable tenants, and that given the bitter history between their two families, she believed it would be best for everyone involved if the contract were amicably terminated, with a full refund of all monies paid. Celeste replied that the contract was legally binding, that she had paid 6 months in advance, and that she fully intended to work the land for those 6 months and renew when the time came. Mrs. Eulalia's voice hardened. She said an Anderson had no business being on this land. Celeste met her eyes and said that an Anderson had drawn up the blueprints for the irrigation canal this land was begging for 41 years ago, and she was here to finish what had been started. Mrs. Eulalia's face froze for a fraction of a second. An emotion flickered across her features like a thin cloud passing over the sun, altering the light just briefly, disturbing, unreadable, before her expression locked shut once more. She said with glacial coldness that she would be seeking legal counsel, and she turned and left. Celeste watched the wagon kick up red dust as it rolled away. Then she turned back to her wooden stakes and kept working. That night, lying in bed, listening to the dark brush country outside, she thought about Mrs. Eulalia. There was something in the older woman's face she couldn't shake. It wasn't wickedness. She was sure of that. It was calcified pain. It was the face of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying a specific version of a story, building an armor around it so thick that the armor eventually became the person. Armors like that are incredibly hard to shed. Sometimes they need an outsider to press a finger right into the weakest chink, but the opening has to be there. You can't force a crack from the outside. It has to give from within. Celeste didn't know where the crack was yet, but she was paying attention. The next day, Henry showed up at the farm carrying a pickaxe, a long-handled shovel, and a proper spirit level he had purchased in the nearest city, a 2-day ride away. He offered his usual brief good morning, walked straight over to the staked line, studied the slope for a moment, pulled the level from his jacket pocket, and checked the grade. Then he announced it was perfectly true. Celeste remarked that her grandmother knew her math. He agreed. He also added, without looking up at her, that he heard his mother had paid a visit. Celeste said it had been a highly educational conversation. He offered an apology for her behavior. He explained that his mother had spent her whole life constructing a narrative that demanded a villain, and she had found her villains in the Anderson family. He admitted he had tried to talk her down from that ledge multiple times over the years, to no avail. Celeste told him an apology wasn't necessary, that Mrs. Eulalia had her reasons, and you can't argue reasons away with logic. You just have to wait for life to offer up enough proof for a person to rewrite them on their own. He looked up at her then. His expression bordered on a question, the look of a man who just heard exactly what he needed to hear, but doesn't quite know what to do with it yet. He hoisted the pickaxe onto his shoulder and said, "Well, let's break ground." The labor was brutal and simple all at once, possessing that unique quality of physical work that exhausts the body but frees the mind to wander. The initial trenching was the hardest part, dirt baked to concrete by decades of merciless Texas sun, striking bedrock exactly where the little notebook predicted they would, as if Rosalina had mapped the earth from the inside out. Celeste worked from early dawn until the midday heat became unbearable, rested in the shade during the worst hours, and picked up her shovel again at 3, working until dusk swallowed the sky. Henry would show up after the schoolhouse let out, sometimes early mornings on his days off, sometimes late afternoons, and there were days he stayed until the sun had completely vanished behind the western scrub. They didn't talk much while they dug. There was something in the silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable. It was that rare, shared quiet that exists between two people who have reached an understanding without needing to negotiate it aloud. Celeste swung the pickaxe. He shoveled the loose dirt. She measured, he checked the level, she read the notebook, and he listened to the dimensions, occasionally commenting that her grandmother had factored in a fraction of an inch of tolerance on the slope. A clear sign of someone who understood how water behaves during a flash flood, not just a drought, which was far harder to calculate since heavy rain shifts the soil density and alters the flow rate. Celeste asked how he knew all that. He explained he'd studied civil engineering in Houston for 2 years before moving back to Red Bluff, that he had left hoping never to return, but came back anyway because the town was desperate for a teacher after the old one fell gravely ill. Celeste said that was a generous sacrifice. He replied it wasn't about being generous. It was a choice between what he selfishly wanted and what he knew was right. And sometimes doing the right thing wins out, not because it's the strongest urge, but because it's the most persistent. Celeste said she understood that kind of math perfectly. A new silence fell between them, carrying a different texture than before, heavier, more alert. One afternoon during the second week, they were resting in the shade of a cottonwood grove that grew along the creek bank. Drinking cold water from a clay jug Celeste had learned to keep buried in the cool, damp earth. The sun was at its brightest, the brush country shimmering with heat distortion, and a lone cicada had decided to camp out in the branches directly above them, buzzing with an unwavering obsession. Henry spoke up suddenly without any preamble, saying there was something he wanted to ask. He said he knew the history of his grandfather Edward from his family's perspective, his mother's version that his grandfather had loved and lost, and the fault lay squarely on Rosalie's weak-willed, debt-ridden father. But he asked if the notebook shed any light on her side of the story, Rosalie's perspective. Celeste stared at the running creek for a long moment before answering. Then she explained that the notebook wasn't a diary. Her grandmother didn't write down her feelings plainly. She wrote recipes and equations, hiding her heart inside them like a seed inside a peach. But there was one sentence, on a folded page, that she believed explained everything. She opened the little black book to the exact page and read it aloud, the sentence declaring that Rosalie hadn't cursed a single thing, that she had safeguarded everything she knew about the land because keeping it safe was the only way she had left to care for it. Silence hung heavy when she finished reading. A thick, expanding quiet, accompanied only by the cicada grinding out its relentless tune above. Henry said, his voice slow and deliberate, that the narrative his mother had preached like gospel was that Rosalie rode away screaming curses at the farm, that this was the reason the soil went barren, that it was a literal curse, spat out in venomous rage. Celeste said that didn't sound much like the woman who wrote those pages. He agreed softly. No, it doesn't sound like her at all. They fell silent again. A hummingbird darted toward the water's edge, hovered for a magical second with that beautiful impossibility hummingbirds possess, and vanished. Henry spoke again, his voice dropping lower. He admitted he had begun to suspect that the story his family had paraded around for decades was nothing more than a way to redistribute guilt. That if Rosalie had cursed the place, then the blame for the farm's ruin rested on her shoulders, not on his grandfather Edward, who had willfully chosen to let his legacy die of a broken heart instead of fighting for it after his love was taken away. Celeste looked at him. It was the most fiercely personal thing he had confessed since they met, and it had cost him something to say it. She could see it in the tight set of his jaw, in the way he stared at the rushing water instead of her, as if the river were easier to face than his own stark realizations. She said gently that admitting such a thing took courage. He shook his head. "It's not courage. I just read too many books. And books teach you that the stories we inherit are rarely as simple as the people telling them want them to be." She told him she couldn't agree more. And then they both sat watching the creek for a span of time that defied measurement. The sweltering midday heat pressing down on the world, the babbling water serving as a patient, steady commentary on the truths they had finally unearthed. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like right now and share it with someone who loves a good tale. It really helps the channel keep bringing stories like this to you. Now let's continue. The weeks rolled by with the distinct quality of time spent in hard labor. They flew past, yet every day was etched into memory because every sundown meant another 3 feet of canal, and a finished trench is something you can see with your own 2 eyes, anchoring time into the earth. The canal grew foot by foot. It was genuine, back-breaking manual labor. No heavy machinery, no hired hands, just the 2 of them. Some days they tore through 10 good feet. Other days they hit a stubborn slab of limestone that demanded hours of crowbar, wedge, and sheer grit. An entire day's sweat sacrificed for a mere 4 feet of unyielding rock. Celeste found she could read the terrain in ways she didn't realize she knew. It was as if her hands were recalling a trade her brain had never formally studied, but she knew it wasn't muscle memory. It was the notebook. It was having pored over her grandmother's figures so many times that she understood the logic pulsing beneath them. She knew why the trench needed to be that deep, why the grade had to angle just so, rather than taking the more intuitive, direct slope that would only cause the water to gain too much violent speed where it shouldn't. One late afternoon, Henry leaned on his shovel and mentioned she had a natural gift for engineering. Without breaking her rhythm, she replied that her gift was simply paying close attention to things. That reading land and reading words were basically the same skill, provided you understood what the author was trying to say. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him give a real, genuine laugh, not the amused exhale that passed for humor before, but a real laugh, short, slightly startled, the sound of a man who hadn't expected to find joy in a ditch covered in red dirt. Celeste glanced up, caught the smile breaking across his face, and looked back down at the trench with her usual stoic expression. But something inside her chest shifted, quietly and inconveniently, like a stone that had been sitting still for years and suddenly rolled down a hill. She ignored the feeling and kept digging. It was around this time that she paid her first visit to Miss Hattie's house. Everett had brought her up during a supply run. The storekeeper, while wrapping up a sack of flour, casually mentioned there was an elderly woman in town, Miss Hattie, 94 years old, who had worked as a kitchen girl out at Crimson Ridge when she was just a child. That she knew everything that went down in 1891 because she had been inside the house, watching it all unfold. Celeste went that very afternoon. Miss Hattie lived in a small, low-roofed house down a dirt alley behind the church, fronted by a medicinal herb garden that smelled of rosemary and lemongrass, a scent that was simultaneously clinical and deeply welcoming. The front door was propped open, as is the custom for folks who have lived in the same tiny town for decades. A granddaughter in her 40s named Ida appeared in the doorway looking equal parts suspicious and nosy, and went to ask her grandmother if she was receiving visitors. Miss Hattie was. The ancient woman sat in a rocking chair in a bedroom smelling of epizot and the faint smoke of a tallow candle. She was 94 and had been blind since she was 70, but she possessed a gravity that Celeste felt the moment she crossed the threshold, the aura of someone who had lived so long she no longer required eyes to truly see. Her cloudy eyes stared straight ahead, yet her face snapped precisely toward Celeste the second she entered, as if a sharper, older sense were guiding her. She ordered Celeste to sit, then asked, without any sugar-coating, who she was. Celeste stated her full name. Miss Hattie fell silent. Then, in a voice as deep and unhurried as a slow river, she noted that the Anderson family had moved away from these parts a long, long time ago. She asked if they were kin. Celeste replied that Rosalie Drummond Anderson was her grandmother. The silence that followed was unlike any Celeste had experienced since arriving in Red Bluff. It was a silence with texture, with temperature, carrying the specific gravity of an event that had been pending for decades and was finally coming to pass. Miss Hattie spoke slowly, saying she had known Rosalie, that she was just 6 years old in 1891, already helping her mother in the big house kitchen, the way poor children did back then, that she had witnessed a great many things on that fateful October night. Celeste said she was ready to listen. The old woman began her tale. And what she shared, speaking with the hushed reverence of someone who tells a story not for gossip but out of duty, added a layer to the tragedy that neither family had ever fully grasped. She said she saw Rosalie the afternoon before she was taken away. The girl had rushed into the kitchen for water, crying, but not with the soft tears of ordinary sadness. She was weeping with fury, which is a different beast altogether. The rage of someone who knows they are being wronged, but lacks the power to stop it. And she had muttered, more to herself than to the 6-year-old Hattie standing nearby, that she refused to go, that she had begged her father to hold out for just 1 more month, pleaded with him. But her father had told her time was up, that the bank wouldn't wait another month for the debt. And Rosalie had sworn with a fiery intensity that burned itself into the little girl's memory. Edward is waiting for my word. We have a plan. We have a way to make it all right, if only my father would give us 30 more days. But her father hadn't given them a single day. Celeste sat listening, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing shallow and quiet. Miss Hattie went on, explaining that the rumour infecting the town, the tale that Rosalie had screamed a curse upon the land, was a twisted mutilation of the truth. What Rosalie actually shouted, as her father violently hauled her into the back of his wagon while Edward screamed her name from the gate, was, "Edward, this land is going to dry up and die if you don't take care of it." It wasn't a hex. It was a warning. It was a cold, hard fact. It was a farmer's daughter who knew that soil better than anyone, predicting exactly what would happen if the man she loved surrendered his fight for his own legacy. And it came to pass. Edward stopped fighting, and the land dried up. Celeste walked out of Miss Hattie's house as dusk settled, her mind heavy with a burden that wasn't painful. It was the profound weight of puzzle pieces snapping into their rightful place after a lifetime of being scattered. She walked back to the farm along the red dirt road, the setting sun casting long golden stripes through the brush, thinking about all the stories people invent regarding the things they lose, and how desperately they need to manufacture an outside villain just to survive the crushing guilt of their own failures. The following week, she went back to see Miss Hattie. Not digging for more secrets, but simply because she had grown fond of the old woman in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Hattie possessed the wisdom of those who have listened so long they know exactly when to speak and when to bite their tongues. Celeste deeply respected that trait. Perhaps her years as a telegraph operator had taught her that knowing when to transmit a message was just as vital as knowing what to say. On that second visit, Miss Hattie confessed she was holding on to one last piece of the puzzle, a secret she had guarded for years, waiting for the right soul to entrust it to. She revealed that right before Edward died in 1918, he had called his son, Henry's father, Arthur, to his bedside. He confessed that the land had never been cursed by anyone, that he himself had murdered the farm through his own neglect, letting his heartbreak sour into apathy. And he made his son swear an oath. If ever someone arrived with the right heart for the land, he was to let them heal it. He was to put no obstacles in their path. Miss Hattie smiled a toothless smile and said she reckoned the person with the right heart had finally arrived. Celeste said she surely hoped so. The old woman's smile deepened, crinkling the edges of her worn face, making her look decades younger. I ain't just talking about you, child. I'm talking about the both of you. Celeste offered no reply, but she stepped out of the house with a faint flush in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Texas sun, which had long since dipped behind the church steeple. The canal was 3/4 of the way finished when the bad news hit. It was a Thursday afternoon, 4.5 weeks into the dig. Celeste returned from town to find a folded sheet of paper tied to the gate wire with a piece of string. It was a formal legal notice from the county clerk's office, signed by Horace in his careful, rounded handwriting, the script of a man forced to officiate matters he deeply disapproves of. It stated that a formal injunction against the lease had been filed by Mrs. Eulalia Sterling, citing irregularities in the leasing process and a failure to secure the consent of all legal heirs. Celeste read the document twice, standing at the gate in the sweltering heat. She folded it, tucked it into her pocket, walked inside and sat on the porch. She sat there thinking for a long time, employing that trademark calmness folks often mistook for ice, but which was merely the discipline of a woman who knew panic had never solved a single problem. What Mrs. Eulalia had done wasn't illegal. She was using the law as a weapon. And Celeste had no money for lawyers. She had blown her savings on the 6 months' rent, the tools, the seeds, and her meager supplies. The contract was ironclad, but injunctions could stall renewals, drag out in court, and make her life so legally miserable that she'd be forced to abandon the land without a formal eviction. The canal was almost done, only 20 feet left. She barely slept that night. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind howl through the brush, weighing her options with the ruthless pragmatism she applied to everything. No dramatics, no rushing, just a cold assessment of the odds. Henry arrived early the next morning. When she handed him the notice, he stared at the paper in dead silence, an unreadable storm brewing behind his eyes. Then, his voice dangerously low, he admitted his mother had threatened to pull a stunt like this. Celeste said she figured as much. He swore he would go talk to her, that he would fix it. Celeste stopped him, telling him he could try, but he shouldn't do it for the wrong reasons. He shouldn't fight his mother just to save a piece of paper. If he was going to confront her, he needed to do it to finally tell her the absolute truth about the fairy tale she'd been weaponizing for decades. He stared at her. It was the most fiercely direct challenge she had laid at his feet since they met, and it struck a nerve. She saw it not in his face, which remained guarded, but in the sudden tension in his shoulders, the sharp intake of breath before he spoke. He said she was damn right. Celeste said she knew she was. He almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh, just an exhale and a twitch at the corner of his mouth before he locked it down. But she saw it. And this time, she didn't look away. He rode out to confront Mrs. Eulalia that very afternoon. Celeste never asked what words were exchanged behind those closed doors, and he never offered them. Some wars between a mother and son are nobody else's business. But what she did know was that 2 days later the injunction was officially withdrawn. Horace sent a brief, apologetic note confirming the retraction. Celeste read it, filed it away in the parlor desk alongside the original threat, and marched right back out to the trench. 20 feet left. Those final 20 feet proved to be the most grueling stretch of the entire property. They hit a dense vein of wet, compacted clay that fought the pickaxe with the stubborn fury of something that had rested undisturbed for centuries and fiercely resented the intrusion. It was agonizing, inch-by-inch labor, requiring a brutal choreography of the iron crowbar, wooden wedges, and buckets of water to soften the clay, just enough for the shovel to bite. Some days their progress was virtually invisible, but within that punishing physical grind emerged those rare moments where the body goes on autopilot, freeing the mind to truly observe. Celeste noticed the efficiency in Henry's swing, powerful but never rushed. The meticulous professorial care he took every time he checked the spirit level, a man used to proving why a thing must be exactly so. She noticed how, when she called out a measurement from the notebook, he listened intently, never interrupting, only speaking to add value. Late one afternoon, working shoulder to shoulder in the deepest muck of the clay vein, he spoke up without lifting his eyes from the dirt, saying there was something he'd been needing to get off his chest. Celeste kept digging. She told him to speak his mind. He paused, leaning on his shovel, carefully weighing his words like a man selecting stepping stones to cross a raging river, choosing only the ones guaranteed to hold his weight. He confessed he had spent way too much of his life making decisions based purely on what he didn't want to become. He was terrified of becoming his grandfather, of caving to family pressure when he should have stood his ground. He dreaded being a man whose weakness destroyed the people he loved, and that paralyzing fear had morphed into a habit of walking away before anything real could even begin, because it was infinitely safer to never start than to start and fail spectacularly. Celeste stopped digging. She looked right at him. He muttered that he wasn't explaining himself very well. She told him he was, that he was explaining himself perfectly. A heavy silence fell, carrying the weight of an unasked question, hovering between them as undeniable as the trench at their feet. Celeste took a breath and told him she had come out to this desolate farm just to survive, to claim a piece of dirt as her own long enough to rebuild her life. She never expected to find anything out here but hard labor, dry soil, and too much time to think. But she had learned in the sweat of these past weeks that the things you stumble upon, when you aren't desperately looking for them, end up holding the most value. Because when you're frantic for something, you already know what you want to see, and that blinds you to what's actually there. It was the closest thing to a declaration of love she had ever made in her life, and she delivered it in her exact same tone, calm, direct, faintly ironic. But a traitorous flush crept up her neck, and she prayed to God he didn't notice. He noticed, but he had the grace not to point it out. Instead, he looked her dead in the eye and said, with striking simplicity, that hearing her say that took a massive weight off his shoulders. Then they grabbed their shovels and went back to the canal, but the air between them had fundamentally shifted. The distance had closed, not the physical space which remained the same. But the profound, invisible gap had vanished, the distance between two people who had silently, without grand gestures or flowery words, decided that whatever was growing between them was finally worth the risk. The final yard of the trench was conquered on a Tuesday morning, wrapping up the 5th week of back-breaking work. It was a brilliant, crystal-clear Texas morning, the wind blowing in from the northeast, carrying the scent of damp sagebrush. It had stormed 3 days prior, the first heavy rain of the season, and the lower soil was still rich with moisture. The air possessed that electric, awakened quality that sweeps across the plains after a storm, as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath and stood a little taller. Celeste and Henry worked those final feet in complete silence. There was a palpable electricity humming around them that neither dared name, the approach of a monumental moment that required no words to validate its magnitude. When the shovel finally broke through to the water's entry point by the creek bank, Celeste wiped the spirit level on her apron and checked the grade one last time. It was flawless. It matched the precise fractions Rosalie had calculated 41 years ago, penned in tiny script inside a notebook that had traveled all the way from Galveston to Red Bluff in a canvas satchel. Henry stood beside her, leaning on his shovel, watching her face. She looked up at him. "This is it," she said. "This is it," he echoed. Together, wielding the crowbar and the shovel, they breached the final wall of dirt. The earth surrendered with a soft, yielding sigh, almost gentle for an act of such violence, and the creek water, which they had dammed up the night before with carefully stacked stones, surged forward to meet the trench. It didn't rush in like a wild flood. It crept in steadily, a deliberate ribbon of water advancing calmly down the stone-lined channel, adhering to the calculated slope, sweeping smoothly around the bend where they had chiseled down a limestone outcrop to protect the flow. It traveled the entire 140 feet they had agonizingly carved by hand over 5 brutal weeks, and finally spilled out onto the north field, where the cracked, thirsty red dirt had been waiting for half a century. The water sank deep into the earth. Celeste watched it in absolute silence. Something swelled in her chest that went far beyond the satisfaction of a job well done. It was something ancestral, the profound realization that an event deeply delayed, not just for her, not just for the farm, but for the universe itself, had finally come to pass. A 41-year debt had been paid in full. Henry stood quietly at her shoulder, feeling the exact same tremors. If this story is touching your heart, leave your like here now and subscribe to the channel. It's free and makes all the difference for Tales of Yesteryear to keep bringing stories like this. We are reaching the most important moment. It was Ida, Miss Hattie's granddaughter, who happened to be walking down the road toward the general store and spotted the two of them staring at the dirt. She stopped dead in her tracks. She tilted her head, listening. Then she sprinted toward the gate, her eyes wide as saucers. She gasped that she heard the sound of rushing water, a sound that had never existed on that side of the property before. She asked what on earth they had done. Celeste simply said they had opened the canal. Ida stared in awe at the water soaking into the baked clay of the north field. Then she whispered, her voice trembling, that her Grandma Hattie had once told her how Rosalie had described the exact sound the water would make when it finally hit that field. Rosalie had claimed the water would sing a different tune there because the bedrock below was hollow, and it would echo like water drumming on a snare, like a soft heartbeat thumping against the earth. Celeste and Henry locked eyes. Ida frantically declared she had to go fetch her grandmother, that Miss Hattie had always sworn that the day she heard that heartbeat drum, it would finally be time. Time for what? Ida had asked her years ago. And the old woman had replied, time to tell the rest of the story. Ida took off running down the red dirt road, kicking up dust in the morning heat. Celeste and Henry walked into town together, heading straight for Miss Hattie's house. They didn't rush. The gravity of the moment forbade rushing. They carried the solemn weight of people who know that whatever awaits them at the end of the road is going to alter history, and arriving a minute earlier wouldn't change the outcome. Miss Hattie was rocking in her chair when they entered. Ida stood by her side, eyes shining with the adrenaline of someone who realizes they've just stumbled into a legend. The old woman's chin was raised high, her blind eyes fixed on the ceiling, and her face wore an expression Celeste could only describe as pure salvation. The crushing relief of a soul who has hauled a boulder up a mountain for a lifetime and is finally allowed to drop it. Miss Hattie commanded them to sit. They sat. She rocked in silence for a few moments, the wooden runners creaking a steady rhythm. Then she spoke, saying she had waited a lifetime to tell this truth in the right order, to the right people. She reminded Celeste of the story she'd shared about the night Rosalie was dragged away, but she confessed there was a final chapter she had withheld, a secret neither the Andersons nor the Sterlings knew. She revealed that in 1894, 3 long years after Rosalie vanished, Edward received a letter in the mail. It came from a town deep in Oklahoma, where Rosalie was living with the husband her father had forced her to marry. The handwriting wasn't hers, but it had been dictated by her. She had hounded her new husband into writing it and mailing it, wearing down his pride until he finally relented. The letter stated that Rosalie had tried desperately to send word through their secret channel before she was taken, but her messenger had been intercepted by her father. Their grand plan, to pool enough cash to pay off the bank and buy the time they needed, hadn't failed for lack of trying, but because her father had suffocated the message before it ever reached Edward's ears. The letter also swore she held no anger toward Edward. She knew he hadn't given up the fight out of cowardice. She had been physically blocked from telling him this when it mattered, and she needed him to know the truth. And she begged him for one single favor. She begged him not to let their land die. Miss Hattie stopped rocking. The silence in the room was absolute. She whispered that Edward had read that piece of paper so many times over the decades that the ink had practically rubbed off. He kept it folded over his heart, inside his breast pocket, until the day he died. And when he passed, his son Arthur found the letter, alongside one other item, a small white handkerchief embroidered with blue flowers, bearing the initials R.A. in the corner. Celeste gasped, her head snapping up. Miss Hattie explained that Edward, on his deathbed, had told Arthur he found the handkerchief buried beneath the porch floorboards years after Rosalie was taken. He knew she had hidden it there on purpose, leaving behind the only piece of herself she could, as proof she had been there, that she had loved that land, and that her memory was a blessing, not a curse. But Edward couldn't honor her dying wish. He read her words of forgiveness every single day, yet he still couldn't bring himself to work the soil. He let the farm rot from the inside out, exactly like a man who loses his very reason for drawing breath and cannot find the strength to swing a hoe for a ghost. Miss Hattie turned her blind eyes precisely to where Henry sat. Her voice dropped to a fierce whisper. "But there's more, Henry. Arthur kept that letter, and he passed it down to your father, and your father left it for you. It's sitting inside a dark wooden cigar box in the back of your mother's cedar closet. Your mother knows exactly what's in it, and she has never once opened it." The silence that crashed down on the room lasted long enough for the rocking chair to sway back and forth 5 full times before settling. Henry's voice, dragged up from a cavernous depth, finally broke the quiet. "She never opened it because she didn't want to know the truth." Miss Hattie nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I reckon. It was a hell of a lot easier to wrap herself in a cozy lie than to open a box and admit she'd spent her whole life carrying a pitchfork for no goddamn reason." Henry stood up and said he was going to see his mother. Celeste stood up with him. She suggested that before he confronted her, perhaps he should show her the little black notebook. Show her Rosalie's own handwriting, the sentence where she swore she cursed nothing, where she declared she was saving her knowledge because it was the only way left to care for the land. Miss Hattie smiled, that toothless, brilliant smile again. "That girl's got a good head on her shoulders." Celeste smiled faintly. "I learned from my grandmother." The visit to Mrs. Eulalia took place the very next morning. It wasn't framed as an ambush. There was no need for yelling. They only required the truth, and the truth doesn't need a megaphone to shatter a room. Sometimes the most devastating truths are delivered in a conversational murmur, precisely because the theatrical drama surrounding the lie has exhausted everyone involved. Mrs. Eulalia received them in her formal parlor, sitting ramrod straight, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, her body's habitual posture when expecting a siege. When Celeste and Henry walked in together, a flash of something unreadable darted across the older woman's eyes. Shock, maybe, laced with a vulnerability she clamped down on instantly. Henry took the lead. He stated plainly that he had something she needed to see, that he had spoken with Miss Hattie, that the old woman had emptied her conscience, and it was time Eulalia heard the facts. Mrs. Eulalia's jaw tightened. He told her he knew about the dark wooden box in her cedar closet. And he knew exactly what was inside it. The colour drained from Eulalia's face. The shift was subtle, but it was enough to prove that her ironclad armour had finally cracked. Celeste stepped forward and gently laid the little black notebook on the parlour table, open to the folded page containing Rosalie's final paragraph. She stated, her voice steady and respectful, that this was her grandmother's ledger, written while she lived on that farm, or born of her desperate memories of it. And there was a passage inside she believed Mrs. Eulalia had every right to read. Eulalia glared at the book. She didn't reach for it immediately. She stared at it as if touching the paper would physically burn her. Then, agonizingly slowly, her hand trembling just a fraction, she picked it up. She read it. Her black eyes tracked the tiny handwriting line by line, moving with a slowness that proved she wasn't just skimming. She was absorbing every single agonizing word, letting the truth carve its way in. When she finished, she set the notebook gently back on the table. She kept her hands resting flat on the cover for a long moment, as if holding the pages down so they wouldn't blow away. Celeste broke the silence, her tone laced with a profound, terrifying gentleness. "My grandmother never cursed a single blade of grass, Mrs. Eulalia. She was dragged away in terror, and she left behind the only legacy she possessed, her blueprints to save that land. The canal she designed in that book 41 years ago was finished yesterday. The water is running through the north field right now." Mrs. Eulalia sat frozen. The parlour smelled heavily of lemon oil and old wood, the silence punctuated only by the relentless, patient ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Then, her voice stripped of its usual booming authority, reduced to a fragile rasp, she confessed, "I knew the letter was in there. Arthur told me before he passed, but I couldn't open it, because if I opened it, I would have to tear down the entire history I had spoon-fed Henry since he was a boy. I had screamed to the heavens that the Andersons ruined us for so long. I didn't know how to turn back without admitting my entire life was built on a delusion." The silence that followed wasn't suffocating. It was the necessary hollow quiet that settles over a battlefield after the final shot is fired and the smoke begins to clear. Celeste spoke softly, offering a grace that wasn't pity, but something much stronger. "It wasn't your whole life. It was just a story. And the stories we inherit are rarely the ones we would choose to write. We can only fix them once we finally have the courage to read the final page." Mrs. Eulalia turned her head, staring out the parlour window at an ancient gnarled oak tree in the yard that looked like it had witnessed a century of foolish pride and had nothing left to say about it. She stared until the sun shifted, altering the light in the room. Without looking back at them, she whispered, "There's a wooden box in my closet. Henry, you can go fetch it whenever you're ready. It's long past time." He walked down the hall. He returned carrying a simple dark mahogany cigar box with an unturned brass latch. He opened it on the parlour table. Inside lay the letter from 1894, its creases worn so deep they looked scarred into the paper, alongside a separate sheet penned by Edward's hand. Not a letter, but brief, anguished instructions left for his son. Henry read it silently, his face locked into that familiar, guarded mask Celeste knew meant a hurricane was tearing through him, and he was fighting to keep the walls from blowing out. When he finished, he carefully folded the fragile papers and slid them into his breast pocket, resting over his heart, the exact same way Edward had carried them for decades, without anyone ever telling Henry to do so. Eulalia watched his gesture. Something nameless and utterly shattered passed over her features. She asked, her voice softer than Celeste had ever heard it, "Is the farm prospering now, with the water?" Henry nodded. He told her they had seeded the ground the first week, and with the canal running, the north field was going to yield a massive harvest. Eulalia closed her eyes. "Good. That is very good." And that was it. There was no theatrical wailing, no tearful embraces. This wasn't a cheap dime novel where everyone miraculously changes their entire personality in one scene. It was simply an old, tired woman who had lugged around a toxic lie for decades, finally dropping the dead weight, feeling the bone-deep exhaustion of knowing she should have let it go years ago, and fully realizing the horrific cost of her pride. Henry and Celeste walked out of the house into the late morning heat. They strolled side by side down the dirt road back toward the farm, the midday sun baking the earth beneath their boots, the brush country alive with the chaotic buzz of insects that sounded almost like music once you stopped trying to fight it. Henry remarked that Rosalie's letter was the most devastatingly honest thing he had ever read, that she told Edward she harbored no bitterness, that she understood, that she only begged him to keep the farm alive because the soil was innocent and it was a sin to make the earth pay for the cruelty of men. Celeste listened. He added that Edward couldn't do it. He let the farm die anyway because he couldn't separate the physical dirt from the agonizing memories buried inside it. Celeste noted that people often do that. They blur the lines, confusing the land with the person, the house with the memory, the physical place with the ghost that haunts it. And it's nearly impossible to untangle them when the grief is that blinding. He agreed. He confessed he had been doing the exact same thing his whole life, just in a different font. He had tangled the tragedy of his grandfather with a paralyzing terror of repeating it. He had used that fear as a shield to push away anyone who mattered, convinced it was safer to die empty-handed than to hold something beautiful and risk having it ripped away. Celeste smirked faintly and said she had noticed. He chuckled. He said he figured she had. The sun climbed higher, shrinking the shadows beneath the mesquite trees into tight, dark pools. A white heron drifted high overhead, looking like a tiny chalk mark against the vast, impossibly blue Texas sky. When they reached the rusted iron gate of the farm, Henry stopped. She stopped beside him. They faced each other, the twisted branches of the old mesquite tree casting a dappled shadow across their boots. He looked at her, his voice finally stripped of all its careful armor. "I am not walking away this time." Celeste met his eyes. "Then don't." And that was how it happened. No grand declarations, no sweeping cinematic romance designed to manipulate a reader. Just two fiercely independent people who had sweated side by side for weeks, who had investigated a tragedy from opposing trenches and finally saw the whole battlefield, who had manually hauled stones to build something built to last, deciding right then and there that what they were building between themselves was worth the exact same sweat and blood. He reached out his hand. She placed hers in his, not as a polite greeting, as an ironclad vow. Her palm was calloused from weeks of swinging a pickaxe. His was too, and there was more poetry in that rough friction than in any sonnet, proof they had marched through the same hell to reach this exact coordinate, wearing the same scars, neither pretending that saving a legacy came without a heavy price. They stood there at the gate, engulfed by the golden brush country, listening to the canal water rushing through the north field, with that soft, rhythmic thumping Rosalie had predicted half a century ago, the water beating against the hollow bedrock, sounding the exact heartbeat the earth had been waiting for, demanding half a lifetime to finally echo. The months that followed were the golden era Crimson Ridge Farm had been promised decades ago. The north field yielded a harvest that blew Celeste's wildest calculations out of the water. The corn stalks shot up thick and green, the beans produced abundantly, and the pumpkins sprawled across the clay with that aggressive, joyful dominance a pumpkin vine exhibits when it finally hits rich soil, endless water, and has the space to conquer the world. Celeste adapted to the grueling life of a farmer faster than she ever thought possible. There was an energy in the land that felt desperate to be nurtured, responding to her hands with a terrifying speed, as if the soil itself were weeping with relief that someone had finally decided to stay. Henry rode out every Saturday and Sunday morning. During the week, whenever the school bell rang early, he'd show up in the afternoon. They fell into a rhythm that required no formal negotiation, the seamless dance of two people learning the intricate details of someone else's soul, while simultaneously figuring out who they were meant to be. Mrs. Eulalia paid her first unannounced visit to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 months after the reckoning in her parlour. She rolled up in a buggy, carrying a fresh-baked cornmeal pound cake wrapped in a checkered cloth. She gruffly announced she had baked far too much and despised waste. Celeste nodded, thanked her, and put a pot of coffee on the stove. They sat on the wraparound porch, drinking black coffee and watching the canal irrigate the north field, actively avoiding any mention of the injunction, the letters, or the ghosts. They talked about the weather, the corn yield, and a bizarre cough syrup recipe Celeste had deciphered from the notebook, which Eulalia claimed she remembered from her childhood under a different name, but using the exact same roots. It was a truce. It wasn't an overnight miracle. Eulalia was a woman who had spent 50 years laying bricks to build her emotional fortress, and fortresses don't crumble over a single cup of coffee, no matter how good the brew is. But Celeste discovered, as the months bled into seasons, a foundational integrity in the older woman that had simply been buried alive under the desperate need to blame someone else for her family's ruin. And as that integrity was given room to breathe, it surfaced in tiny, jarring gestures, a wild plum preserve recipe jotted on a scrap of paper handed over a month later, a quiet, off-hand murmur while staring out at the fields that Rosalie had been a damn genius to calculate the canal's slope so perfectly. Celeste accepted every olive branch without ever demanding an apology. She just kept working the land and pouring the coffee whenever Eulalia's buggy rattled up the drive. One late afternoon, Celeste was sitting on the porch, rereading the little black notebook, when Eulalia arrived earlier than usual and caught her with it open on her lap. The older woman froze at the top of the porch steps. Then, in a voice stripped of all its usual gravel, she asked if she might look at it. Celeste handed it over. Eulalia turned the pages with agonizing slowness, studying the geometry, the tonics, the scribbled equations. She lingered for a very long time on the folded page, containing the confession that keeping the knowledge safe was her only way left to care. Then, she closed the book with immense reverence and handed it back. She whispered she loved this dirt with everything she had. Celeste simply said, "I know." Eulalia looked at her, her tone shifting into something fiercely intimate, the voice of a proud woman pushing out words that took a lifetime to find. "And you take care of it exactly the way she did, exactly the way this little book proves she loved it." Celeste didn't reply, but a sudden, fierce warmth flared in her chest, an emotion too profound to show on her face, anchoring itself deep in her bones. The staggering vindication of being truly seen by the very woman who had spent a lifetime trying to erase her bloodline. When the 6-month lease expired, it was renewed without a hitch. This time, it was drafted for 2 years, at a highly favorable rate negotiated directly with Henry, who had officially taken over the Sterling estate's management with his mother's full blessing. The paperwork was sterile, bureaucratic, and utterly devoid of drama. But there was one bizarre addendum Henry had forced into the contract, a clause Horace the clerk found highly irregular, but notarized anyway because it was perfectly legal. Upon the conclusion of the 2-year lease, the tenant retains the exclusive right to purchase the deed to the property at fair market value, entirely exempt from any arbitrary surcharges or bidding. Celeste read the clause while sitting across the desk in the clerk's office, Horace shifting uncomfortably in the middle, Henry sitting stoically beside her. She glanced at Henry, who wore his usual impenetrable mask, calm, direct, but with that faint crinkling at the corners of his eyes she now knew was his version of an ear-to-ear grin. She slid the paper back and said, That's an incredibly generous term. He didn't miss a beat. It's an incredibly practical term. Horace, a man who survived local politics by aggressively minding his own business and was currently sweating through his shirt trying to do just that, aggressively polished his spectacles and mumbled that they could sign whenever they were ready. They signed. The wedding took place in the winter of 1934 on a crisp July morning. Though in Texas, winters fall differently, let's say a crisp December morning, beneath a sprawling, cloudless blue sky. The brush country smelling of sweet wood smoke and a sharp northern breeze that didn't bite, but woke the blood. The ceremony was held at the small Red Bluff church, packed to the rafters with townsfolk who had learned, over 2 grueling years, to look at Celeste Anderson with the deep reverent respect reserved for those who prove their worth through backbreaking labor and sheer stubborn survival when everyone else bet against them. Mrs. Eulalia sat dead center in the front pew. Resting in her lap was the little black-covered notebook, which Celeste had personally walked over to her house the night before, stating she felt it was only right Eulalia read it cover to cover before the vows were exchanged. The matriarch had stayed up past midnight reading, returning it before sunrise without a word. But as Celeste walked down the aisle and past her pew, Eulalia looked up with an expression utterly divorced from the bitter judgment that had defined their first meeting. Her eyes were shining with a profound, shattered grace. Miss Hattie was there too. Ida had recruited 2 men to carry the old woman in on a sturdy wooden chair, as her legs had given out entirely. She sat near the front, her sightless eyes cast upward, absorbing the ceremony with the terrifying intensity of someone listening not with their ears, but with their soul. A serene, triumphant smile graced her weathered face, the smile of a sentinel who had guarded a watchtower for a century and was finally hearing the trumpets announce the war was over. On that winter day in 1934, Crimson Ridge Farm was alive. The canal roared with the winter rains. The north field was a sea of green winter wheat. The twisted mesquite tree by the gate was thick with foliage, and sitting proudly on the windowsill of the master bedroom was a blooming pot of wild honeysuckle, Rosalie's favorite flower. Celeste had planted it a week prior without telling a soul, simply because she had read it in the notebook and knew, down to her marrow, that the flower needed to be there. Present, witnessing, Mrs. Eulalia became a fixture at the farm in the years that followed. Something foundational in the air of the place had shifted for her. Or perhaps it was simply the narrative she carried in her own head when she passed through the iron gates. Freed from the ghost story, the wind felt different, the shade of the mesquite tree felt different, the porch felt different, the land hadn't changed a bit, the woman looking at it had, and when the eyes change, the whole world shifts with them. Miss Hattie lived to be 98. Spending her final years wrapped in the smug satisfaction of a woman who had successfully delivered her cargo. Ida swore her grandmother slept like a baby after the canal was opened, that the crushing weight she had carried since 1891 had finally been laid down, like a weary bird that had flown across an ocean and finally found the right branch to land on. Everett, the gossiping storekeeper, spun the epic tale of Celeste and the Sterling farm to every weary traveler who passed through Red Bluff for the rest of his days. Over the decades, the story mutated, sprouting dramatic embellishments that were historically false but emotionally true, the exact way folklore preserves the heartbeat of a community long after the rigid facts erode. And the canal held strong. Inch by inch, stone by stone, held together by the mortar, Celeste had mixed and troweled with her own bleeding hands during those 5 brutal weeks. Every rainy season brought a roaring surge of life. Every blistering Texas summer proved the water was hitting exactly the dirt that needed it most. Years later, when the folks of Red Bluff told the legend of Crimson Ridge Farm, and they told it often because it was the kind of triumph a town guards fiercely and passes down to its children like an heirloom. They blurred the lines between the sweat and the supernatural. They swore the farm had been cursed by a witch in 1891, and a mysterious woman had arrived in 1932 to break the hex without even knowing she held the magic. Whenever Celeste caught wind of that version, she'd scoff and say it was complete nonsense. She hadn't broken any hexes. She had walked onto a piece of dirt, dying of thirst, and dug a ditch. She had walked into a tragedy, missing its final chapter, and accidentally became the ink that finished it. The moral of the story wasn't about breaking a curse. It was about a history screaming into the void, waiting for someone with the guts to sit down and listen to the whole damn thing. Henry, whenever he was within earshot of her giving this speech, would neither confirm nor deny it. He'd just stand there, arms crossed, the corners of his eyes crinkling with that invisible ear-to-ear grin. And the canal water kept running. Every single day, year after year, beating against the hollow bedrock in the north field with the exact drumming rhythm Rosalie had mapped out in tiny cursive inside a black notebook. A notebook that had journeyed all the way back to the dirt, where it was conceived just so someone with the right blood and the right grit could finally finish a masterpiece born of love and interrupted by cruelty. It wasn't magic. It was engineering, pure and simple. It was the grueling, terrifying work of two people learning to trust each other, inch by agonizing inch, down a 140-foot trench. It was the agonizing patience required to sit in the dirt until the earth finally yields its secrets. And it was love, not the cheap, easy kind in the storybooks, but the brutal, calloused love built on the radical belief that the tragedies you inherit don't have to end the way they began. Some things arrive half a century late, but they still arrive right on time. The little black notebook claimed a permanent spot on the parlor mantel, resting beside a brass candlestick and a pressed wild honeysuckle flower, displayed where anyone who walked through the front door could clearly see it. It wasn't a museum exhibit or a boast. It was simply Celeste's acknowledgement that some artifacts are far too vital to remain locked in the dark once their war is won. Rosalie had buried it because hiding it was her only weapon. Celeste possessed the luxury of leaving it in the light. And she did, so that no one would ever have to rip up the floorboards again to find the truth waiting in the dirt. And the right moment, when it finally strikes, feels as inevitable as gravity, like rushing water finding the trench, like a broken history finally colliding with the exact soul needed to make it whole.